In 1839, the British Empire went to war with China. Not over land, not over religion, not over a king's honor, over a leaf. A single crop had become so valuable that an empire was willing to fight a war to protect it, and to keep another drug flowing in the opposite direction just to pay for it. That crop was tea. And by the time the story is over, it will have triggered a war fought over drugs, funded an entire colonial economy, helped spark the birth of the United States, and quietly built one of the most exploitative labor systems of the modern era, all so that people could have something warm and comforting in their cup every morning. This is the history of tea. And it starts, according to legend, with an accident. The story begins around 2737 BC, in ancient China. Legend says Emperor Xin Nong, considered the father of Chinese agriculture and medicine, was boiling drinking water outdoors, as was his habit, when a gust of wind blew a handful of leaves from a nearby tree into the pot. Rather than throw it out, the emperor, who was also known for testing hundreds of herbs on himself to study their properties, decided to drink it. He liked it, and according to the legend, he immediately understood he had discovered something valuable. That tree was Camellia sinensis, the tea plant. Whether or not the emperor himself is historical fact, the plant absolutely is. Wild tea trees have grown for thousands of years in the misty, humid highlands of southwest China, in a region that today spans parts of Yunnan province and stretches into northern Myanmar and Vietnam. Genetic studies of wild tea populations actually confirm this exact region as the plant's likely origin point. For centuries after its discovery, tea wasn't the drink we picture today. Early communities in this region chewed the leaves raw, or crushed them into thick, bitter medicinal pastes, mixed with grains, ginger, or salt, and consumed almost like a soup. It wasn't comfort. The first Europeans to encounter tea were Portuguese traders and missionaries, who came across it in Chinese ports sometime in the 1500s. But Portugal never turned it into a major trade good. That fell to the Dutch. Dutch East India Company ships began bringing small quantities of tea back to Europe starting around 1610, and it arrived as an outrageously expensive luxury, sold in tiny sealed packets, marketed almost like a miracle elixir, affordable only to the aristocracy. England came to tea relatively late, but once it arrived, England is where the story turns from curious footnote to world-altering obsession. In 1662, a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England. Catherine had grown up with tea as a daily habit in the Portuguese court, and she brought a chest of it with her as part of her dowry, along with her personal preference for drinking it regularly. Tea became fashionable at the English royal court almost overnight. If the Queen drank it, aristocratic society wanted it too. Within a few decades, tea had gone from an unknown foreign curiosity to a status symbol among England's wealthy elite. But there was an enormous problem hiding underneath the fashion trend. England cannot grow tea. Neither can France, nor the Netherlands, nor anywhere in Europe. The climate simply doesn't allow it. Every single leaf England wanted had to be shipped roughly 9,000 miles from China, produced entirely on Chinese terms, controlled entirely by Chinese merchants. This is the exact moment a beverage quietly became a geopolitical dependency, one that would eventually justify a war. By the early 1700s, the British East India Company, originally chartered to trade spices, had reorganized almost its entire business model around one product, tea. British demand was exploding. By 1750, tea had moved beyond the aristocracy and become a fixture in ordinary middle-class British homes. By 1800, the average British household. The first Europeans to encounter tea were Portuguese traders and missionaries, who came across it in Chinese ports sometime in the 1500s. But Portugal never turned it into a major trade good. That fell to the Dutch. Dutch East India Company ships began bringing small quantities of tea back to Europe starting around 1610, and it arrived as an outrageously expensive luxury, sold in tiny sealed packets, marketed almost like a miracle elixir, affordable only to the aristocracy. England came to tea relatively late, but once it arrived, England is where the story turns from curious footnote to world-altering obsession. In 1662, a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England. Catherine had grown up with tea as a daily habit in the Portuguese court, and she brought a chest of it with her as part of her dowry, along with her personal preference for drinking it regularly. Tea became fashionable at the English royal court almost overnight. If the Queen drank it, aristocratic society wanted it too. Within a few decades, tea had gone from an unknown foreign curiosity to a status symbol among England's wealthy elite. But there was an enormous problem hiding underneath the fashion trend. England cannot grow tea. Neither can France, nor the Netherlands, nor anywhere in Europe. The climate simply doesn't allow it. Every single leaf England wanted had to be shipped roughly 9,000 miles from China, produced entirely on Chinese terms, controlled entirely by Chinese merchants. This is the exact moment a beverage quietly became a geopolitical dependency, a euro, one that would eventually justify a war. By the early 1700s, the British East India Company, a euro originally chartered to trade spices, a euro, had reorganized almost its entire business model around one product, tea. British demand was exploding. By 1750, tea had moved beyond the aristocracy and become a fixture in ordinary middle-class British homes. By 1800, the average British household was spending more money on tea each year than on any single food item besides bread. Tea wasn't a luxury anymore. It was infrastructure. But there was a catch. China, at the time the world's most self-sufficient economy, wanted almost nothing that Britain produced. Chinese merchants were only willing to accept payment in one thing: silver bullion. Britain was draining its silver reserves at an alarming, unsustainable rate, just to keep tea flowing into English teapots. Economists and company officials in London were, quite literally, worried this could bankrupt the empire's trade balance. The East India Company needed to find something, a euro, anything a euro, that Chinese consumers would buy in exchange for silver, or better yet, instead of silver entirely. They found their answer in opium. British-controlled territories in India, particularly Bengal, had ideal growing conditions for opium poppies. The East India Company began cultivating opium there on an industrial scale, a euro, not for British consumption, which was tightly regulated, but explicitly for smuggling into China. Opium was illegal in China. It didn't matter. The company sold it to independent smugglers who ran it into Chinese ports outside official government control, and the smugglers paid the company in silver, a euro, silver the company then used to buy tea. Within decades, the plan worked with devastating efficiency. Opium addiction spread rapidly through Chinese coastal cities. Estimates suggest that by the 1830s, several million people across China were regularly using opium supplied almost entirely through British trade networks. And in a brutal twist, Britain's original silver problem had now completely reversed. A euro silver was flowing out of China and into British hands. The Chinese imperial government recognized the crisis and tried to stop it. In 1839, an imperial commissioner named Lin Zexu was sent to Canton with direct orders to end the opium trade. He seized foreign opium stockpiles, blockaded foreign traders in their warehouses until they surrendered their stock, and then had over 20,000 chests of British opium, a euro, worth millions of pounds, a euro, publicly destroyed. Britain's response wasn't diplomacy. It was war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. It was, in almost every sense, an unfair fight. British warships, equipped with modern steam power and superior naval artillery, devastated a Chinese military that had no real answer for industrial-age weaponry. China lost decisively. The resulting Treaty of Nanking forced China to open 5 major ports to British trade, pay enormous financial reparations, and cede the island of Hong Kong to the British Crown outright. It didn't end there. A second Opium War, from 1856 to 1860, ended even more catastrophically for China, a euro, more ports forced open, more territorial and financial concessions, and the effective legalization of the opium trade across Chinese soil. Step back and look at what actually happened here. The British Empire fought 2 wars using its full military might, essentially to protect its supply chain for a hot beverage, a euro, and financed the entire operation by turning millions of Chinese citizens into opium addicts. This is one of the most consequential and least discussed chapters connected to any everyday product in the world today. Most people who drink tea have never heard a single word of it. If you're finding this one interesting so far, hit subscribe, a euro. We we post a new deep dive into the hidden history of food and drink every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Even after winning 2 wars, Britain still had a strategic vulnerability. They now controlled the ports. They controlled the trade terms. But they still didn't control the supply itself. Every tea plant in the world was still growing on Chinese soil, using Chinese cultivation knowledge that had been refined and guarded for over 1,000 years. So the East India Company decided to simply take it. In 1848, the company hired a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune, already known for smuggling plant specimens out of restricted regions of China on earlier expeditions. This time, his mission was far more ambitious. Infiltrate China's most closely guarded tea-growing districts Euro regions legally closed to foreigners Euro, and extract everything Britain needed to build a rival tea industry from scratch. Fortune shaved the front of his head, grew a queue braid in the Chinese style, dressed as a Chinese merchant, and traveled deep into interior tea-producing provinces under disguise, at real personal risk. Discovery could have meant imprisonment or execution. Over several years, Fortune didn't just smuggle out plants and seeds Euro, he smuggled out expertise. He learned and documented the closely guarded Chinese secret that green tea and black tea actually come from the exact same plant, simply processed differently Euro, something European buyers hadn't previously understood. He recruited skilled Chinese tea workers directly and arranged for them to be shipped to British territory to train new plantation labor. By the end of his expeditions, Fortune had smuggled out an estimated 20,000 tea plants and seedlings, along with the trained workers needed to grow and process them properly. By any modern definition, this ranks among the largest acts of industrial and agricultural espionage in recorded history Euro, and it worked exactly as intended. Fortune's stolen plants, combined with a wild native tea variety that British explorers had separately discovered growing in the Indian region of Assam back in the 1820s, gave Britain everything it needed to build an independent tea industry Euro, completely outside Chinese control. Assam, in northeastern India, and later the hill country of Ceylon Euro, modern-day Sri Lanka Euro, became the new centers of British tea production. And Britain scaled both up with staggering speed and ambition. But an industry this size required an enormous, continuous supply of extremely cheap labor. Tea is not a crop that machines can easily harvest, even today. Each leaf has to be picked by hand Euro, typically just one bud and the 2 youngest leaves beneath it Euro, repeated for hours, across acres of hillside, in punishing heat and humidity. Britain solved its labor problem the same way it had solved a nearly identical problem on Caribbean sugar plantations a century earlier, through a system of indentured labor that, in practical terms, closely resembled slavery. Recruiters Euro, often working on commission, and frequently using outright deception Euro, traveled through poor rural regions of India, promising decent wages and fair conditions on distant tea estates. Workers signed multi-year contracts, often unable to read the terms themselves, and were then transported to remote plantation regions hundreds of miles from home, with no realistic way to leave once they arrived. Conditions on these estates were brutal. Wages were minimal, frequently withheld through manufactured debts to the plantation's own company store. Housing was cramped and unsanitary. Disease Euro, cholera, malaria, dysentery Euro spread easily through worker camps that had no real medical infrastructure. Historians studying mortality records from 19th-century Assam tea estates have found death rates among indentured workers that rival the death rates recorded on Caribbean sugar plantations decades earlier Euro, among the deadliest labor systems in modern history. The tea industry that eventually gave the world its comforting, everyday cup of tea was, quite literally, built on top of one of the most exploitative labor systems of the colonial era. It's a chapter almost never mentioned on a box of tea bags. While Britain was building its tea empire in Asia, tea was about to ignite an entirely different kind of history back in the American colonies. By the 1760s and 1770s, Britain was deeply in debt from the costly 7 Years' War, and Parliament looked to its American colonies to help pay it off Euro, largely through new taxes. Tea, already a daily household staple in colonial America just as it was in Britain, became one of the most visible and most resented taxed goods in colonial life. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. On paper, it actually lowered the price colonists paid for East India Company tea by cutting out middlemen. But the law also quietly reaffirmed Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. A principle colonists found tolerable regardless of the discounted price. Colonial resistance groups organized boycotts up and down the coast. In several ports, tea shipments were simply turned away and sent back to Britain. Boston's situation escalated furthest. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, some loosely disguised as Mohawk warriors to obscure their identities, boarded 3 East India Company ships anchored in Boston Harbor. Over roughly 3 hours, they broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped the entire contents into the harbor water. In today's money, the destroyed tea would be worth well over $1 million. The Boston Tea Party wasn't fundamentally about the price of tea, or even about tea at all. It was a protest about taxation and consent. But tea was the spark. Britain's furious retaliation, shutting down the entire port of Boston, stripping Massachusetts of local self-government, pushed the colonies dramatically closer to open rebellion. A beverage most people think of as gentle and calming helped light the fuse of the American Revolution. While Britain and America were building their own tea stories, tea was quietly reshaping daily life across completely different parts of the world, each developing its own distinct culture around the same plant. In Russia, tea arrived via overland caravan routes from China starting in the 1600s, and by the 1800s it had become a defining feature of Russian domestic life, centered around the samovar, an ornate metal urn used to keep water perpetually hot for endless refills throughout the day. Tea in Russia wasn't a quick habit. It was a social occasion that could stretch for hours. In the Ottoman Empire and later in modern Turkey and Iran, tea eventually displaced coffee as the dominant everyday drink, served strong, sweet, and typically in small tulip-shaped glasses, consumed multiple times throughout the day as a central part of hospitality culture. And in India, the very colony where Britain had built its plantation empire, tea eventually transformed into something the British never anticipated. Indian vendors began preparing it with milk, sugar, and a blend of local spices like cardamom, ginger, and cinnamon, creating what we now know globally as chai. What started as a colonial export crop became one of India's own defining daily rituals, sold on nearly every street corner in the country today. Tea had stopped being a single British commodity. It had become dozens of distinct cultural practices, layered on top of the same plant Robert Fortune once smuggled out of China in disguise. Back in Britain, the 1800s and early 1900s brought rapid industrialization to every stage of tea production. Steam-powered processing machinery replaced hand-rolling. Faster steamships and eventually railways cut shipping times from months to weeks. Tea, once an aristocratic luxury, became genuinely affordable to ordinary working households for the first time in history. Companies built around tea became household names during this period. Thomas Lipton, a Scottish grocer, built a business empire in the late 1800s by buying tea estates directly in Ceylon and cutting out costly middlemen entirely, famously advertising his product as going direct from the tea garden to the teapot. By the early 1900s, Lipton's name had become almost synonymous with tea itself across the English-speaking world. Then came one of the most famous accidental inventions in food history. In the early 1900s, an American tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan began shipping small tea samples to clients in tiny silk bags. Some customers, apparently unsure of the intended use, simply dropped the entire bag straight into hot water rather than emptying the leaves out first. They liked the convenience. The tea bag was born essentially by consumer accident, and it would go on to change how the majority of the world consumes tea to this day. Today, tea is the second most consumed beverage on Earth, behind only water. More than 2 billion cups are consumed globally every single day, and the global tea industry is valued at well over $200 billion. But the uncomfortable truth is that the exploitative labor structures built into the industry during the 1800s never fully disappeared. Investigative reporting in recent years has repeatedly documented extremely low wages, unsafe working conditions, and exploitative practices still persisting on tea estates in parts of India, Sri Lanka, and East Africa, many of them in the exact same regions where Robert Fortune's stolen plants first took root more than 170 years ago. A drink most of us associate with comfort, calm, and cozy mornings was, in reality, built on stolen intellectual property, opium wars, colonial exploitation, and indentured labor systems that killed enormous numbers of people whose names were never recorded. Next time you're holding a warm cup of tea, you're holding one of the most consequential euro and most quietly brutal euro commodities in human history. If this one hit for you, our video on the history of sugar covers an equally dark, equally world-changing story euro links right there. Subscribe if you want a new deep dive into the hidden history of food dropped every week.